Hell's Angel found a baby alone in a shopping trolley during a storm. Then he read the note tucked underneath the rain, came down like nails on Hank Morrison's leather jacket, each drop hitting him with the sting of tiny needles. He leaned into the handlebars of his Harley, squinting through the storm, the road ahead barely visible except for the flashes of lightning that lit up the sky like camera flashes from an angry god. It was a bad night to be out. Hank knew that. Any smart rider would have pulled over an hour ago, found a motel, waited for morning. But Hank wasn't built that way. 20 years on the road had taught him that storms passed, one way or another. You just had to keep moving through them. The supply run had taken longer than expected. Big Jim needed parts for 3 bikes and a case of things Hank wouldn't mention to anyone outside the club. Now it was near midnight, and the highway stretched out before him like a black ribbon. Empty, except for the rain and the wind trying to knock him sideways. His hands were numb on the grips. Water ran down his neck, inside his collar, soaking through to his skin no matter how tight he'd zipped his jacket. The bike's headlight cut a small tunnel of light through the downpour, but beyond that, everything was darkness and noise. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Thunder cracked somewhere close, loud enough that Hank felt it in his chest. He didn't flinch. He'd ridden through worse. But the loneliness of it, the empty road, the empty night, that settled into him different than the rain did. That soaked in deeper. He thought about how it used to be. Not so long ago, really. 2 years wasn't that much time when you added it all up. But it felt like a lifetime since Marcus used to ride beside him on nights just like this one. Both of them laughing about nothing, shouting things at each other that the wind stole away before they ever landed. Marcus used to say riding in the rain was good for the soul, said it washed away everything a man didn't need to be carrying. Hank used to believe that. Now he wasn't so sure. Some things didn't wash away. Some things just settled into a man's bones and stayed there, storm or no storm. A flash of lightning brought Marcus's face back to him, clear as day. Head thrown back, laughing at some joke Hank couldn't even remember now. The wind pulling at his beard. His hand raised off the handlebar for just a second, pointing at something in the sky. Some star or plane or nothing at all. That was Marcus. Always pointing at something. Always finding something worth looking at even when the world around him was falling apart. Hank blinked hard, and the memory was gone, washed away like everything else in the storm. Just the road ahead now, black and wet and endless. He thought about Sarah then too, the way he always did when Marcus crossed his mind. Marcus's girl, though Hank guessed she wasn't a girl anymore. Must be 25, 26 now. He hadn't seen her since the funeral, hadn't tried very hard to, if he was being honest with himself. Guilt did that to a man, made him stay away from the very people he should have been closest to. The rain came harder, if that was even possible, hammering the highway until Hank could barely see past his own front wheel. He needed shelter. Needed somewhere to wait this out before the wind knocked him clean off the bike. Up ahead, through the sheets of water, he spotted lights. A grocery store, closed for the night, but with a wide overhang stretching across the front of the building where delivery trucks usually parked. Good enough. Better than good enough, considering the way lightning kept splitting the sky like it was trying to prove a point. Hank eased off the throttle and guided the bike into the parking lot, tires hissing against the wet asphalt. He pulled up under the overhang, killed the engine, and let the sudden quiet wash over him. Just the rain now, hammering against the metal roof above him, and his own breathing, ragged from the cold. He sat there a moment, catching his breath, wiping water from his eyes. That was when something caught his attention. Off in the far corner of the lot, past the reach of the store's dim security lights, sat a shopping trolley. Alone, still. Everything else in that parking lot was moving. Trash bags tumbling across the pavement, a loose tarp snapping against a fence, even small branches skittering along in the wind. But that trolley didn't move an inch. Hank stared at that trolley for a long moment, water running down his face in little rivers. Something about it bothered him. It wasn't just that it stayed still while everything else in the lot danced around in the wind. It was the way it sat there, like someone had left it on purpose, tucked halfway behind a concrete parking bumper, away from where any cart collector would think to look. Probably nothing, he told himself. Some kid left it there after loading groceries into a car, or store workers had missed it during their last sweep before closing up. There were 100 boring reasons for a shopping cart to sit alone in a parking lot at midnight. But his gut said different. 20 years of riding had taught Hank to trust that feeling in his stomach, the one that showed up right before trouble did. It never lied to him. Not once. Not even when he wished it would. He almost let it go. Almost told himself to stay put under the overhang, dry off best he could, wait for the storm to ease before pushing on toward the clubhouse. Big Jim wasn't expecting the parts until morning anyway. There was no reason to go wandering out into a storm like this one just because a shopping cart looked a little out of place. That was when he heard it. At first, Hank thought it was the wind. The storm had been playing tricks on his ears all night, howling through gaps in the store's metal awning, whistling around the corners of the building in ways that almost sounded human. But this was different. This cut through the wind instead of hiding inside it. A cry. Thin and weak, barely there at all, swallowed up almost as soon as it started by another gust of wind and rain. But Hank had heard it. He knew he had. Every hair on the back of his neck stood up straight, and his blood went cold in a way the storm hadn't managed to do all night. He sat frozen for half a second, telling himself he'd imagined it. Told himself it was some bird caught out in the storm, or a cat yowling from underneath a car somewhere. Anything but what his gut was already screaming at him. Then it came again. Louder this time, or maybe just a break in the wind let more of it through. There was no mistaking it now. That was a baby's cry, small and desperate, coming from somewhere out there in all that darkness and rain. Hank didn't think. He moved. He was off the bike and running before his mind had even caught up with his body, boots slapping hard against wet pavement, rain hammering down on him with a fury that felt almost personal now. The overhang's shelter fell away behind him, and the storm swallowed him whole, needles of rain stinging his face, his hands soaking through his jacket in seconds like it hadn't already been wet enough. The parking lot stretched out longer than it had looked from the shelter of the store. Hank's lungs burned as he pushed through the wind, eyes locked on that trolley in the distance, willing it to be nothing, praying it was nothing, while some deeper part of him already knew it wasn't. Lightning cracked across the sky again, throwing everything into stark white light for half a second. In that flash, Hank saw the trolley clearer now. Something bundled inside it. Small, still, he covered the last stretch of pavement in a dead sprint, heart hammering against his ribs harder than it had in years, harder than it had since the night he got the call about Marcus. Rain blurred his vision, but he didn't slow down, didn't stop until he skidded to a halt right beside the cart, chest heaving, hands trembling as he reached for the soaked blanket bundled inside. He pulled it back just enough to see her. A baby. A newborn girl, couldn't have been more than a few days old, wrapped in a thin blanket that had gone through and through with rain, plastered against her tiny body like a second skin. Her face was scrunched up tight, lips trembling as she let out another weak cry, barely more than a whimper now, like she'd been crying for a long time and had almost nothing left to give. Hank's eyes shot up, scanning the parking lot in every direction. Nothing. No car idling somewhere with its lights off. No figure running for cover. No one waiting nearby to explain how a baby had ended up alone in a shopping cart in the middle of a thunderstorm. Just Hank, the storm, and that tiny, shivering baby girl, utterly alone in the dark. Hank scooped her up before he even thought about how to do it right. She weighed almost nothing, a tiny bundle of skin and bone and cold, wet cloth, and he cradled her against his chest like she might slip through his fingers if he didn't hold on tight enough. "Easy now," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. His voice came out rough, cracked by 20 years of cigarettes and cold nights on the highway, but he made it as soft as he could manage. "I got you. I got you now." He tore open his jacket with one hand, the leather heavy and slick with rain, and tucked her against his shirt, working the jacket back around them both like a shield. The wind fought him the whole way, tugging at the fabric, throwing rain sideways so it found every gap he tried to close. But he got her covered, mostly, her small face pressed against his chest, where his heartbeat hammered loud enough that he wondered if she could feel it too. She was still crying, but softer now, like the warmth of him had taken some of the fight out of the wind for her. Hank turned in a slow circle, scanning the parking lot with eyes that stung from rain and adrenaline both. "Hello?" He called out, his voice swallowed almost instantly by the storm. "Anybody out here?" Nothing answered but thunder, rolling low across the sky like something big was shifting its weight far off in the dark. He turned again, looking past the grocery store's dead front windows, past the row of shopping carts lined up neat against the wall, past the empty handicap spaces with their faded blue paint. No cars, no headlights easing away in the distance, no footprints he could see, though the rain would have washed those out inside of a minute anyway. "Anybody there?" He shouted louder this time, tipping his head back so the words carried further, ignoring the way the rain ran straight into his open mouth. Somebody left a baby out here. Still nothing. Just wind, and rain, and the distant hum of a highway somewhere beyond the lot. Cars passing by, oblivious, none of them slowing down. None of them stopping to notice what waited in this abandoned parking lot at midnight. Hank felt something twist hard in his gut, somewhere between anger and fear and a grief he didn't have a name for yet. Who would do this? Who could leave a baby out here, alone, in a storm like this, and just walk away? He looked down at her face, what little of it he could see tucked against him, and something in his chest cracked wide open. She'd stopped crying almost entirely now, just small hiccuping breaths, exhausted, spent, her eyes were closed, dark lashes wet against pale cheeks, and Hank felt his own throat tighten in a way it hadn't in years. "Okay," he murmured, mostly to fill the silence, mostly to hear something besides the storm. Okay, sweetheart. I gotcha. He needed to get her out of the rain, get her warm, figure out what came next. His mind was already running through it, half-formed, police, hospital, something, anything, when he shifted his grip to settle her more securely against him, and his fingers brushed against something tucked beneath the blanket, right along her side. Paper, folded small, damp through, but not yet soaked to pieces. He froze, staring down at it for half a second before easing it free with 2 fingers, careful not to jostle her while he did it. The paper was fragile in his hand, edges already softening from the rain, ink smeared in places where water had gotten in. He turned slightly, angling his body to block what little he could of the storm, and unfolded it slow, squinting to make out the words in the dark. The handwriting was shaky, rushed, like whoever wrote it had been crying while they did. Please keep her safe. I love her too much to keep her, but I have nowhere else to turn. Below that, 3 words, simple and plain. Her mother who loves her too much to keep her. Hank stood there in the rain, the baby against his chest, the note trembling in his hand, and for a long moment, he didn't move at all. The rain kept falling, hard and steady, drumming against Hank's shoulders like it had somewhere to be. He read the note twice more, though the words didn't change no matter how many times his eyes passed over them. I love her too much to keep her. Not I don't want her. Not I can't be bothered. Something else was going on here. Something that made a mother leave her baby in a shopping cart instead of taking her somewhere warm and safe. His first thought, the right thought, the one that came from 20 years of knowing how the world worked, was clear as day. Call 911. Get an ambulance out here. Let the police handle it. That was the protocol. That was what any decent person would do the second they found an abandoned baby in a parking lot during a storm. He even reached for his phone, patting down his jacket pocket with his free hand while he kept the baby tucked tight against his chest with the other. His fingers found the hard shape of it through the wet denim of his jeans pocket, and he almost pulled it free. Almost. Something stopped him. He couldn't name it right then, not standing there in the rain with thunder cracking overhead and a baby's soft, hiccuping breaths warming the skin of his chest. But it was there. A feeling low in his gut. The same kind of feeling he used to get right before trouble found him on a run, back when his instincts were sharper and younger, and he trusted them without question. This wasn't simple. A woman didn't write a note like that, didn't fold it careful and tuck it beneath a blanket so it wouldn't blow away. If she was just tossing away a baby she didn't want. She was scared. She was desperate. And something told Hank, deep down where he couldn't argue with it, that calling the cops right now, letting the system swallow this baby whole into paperwork and foster placements and strangers' hands, wasn't going to help whoever wrote those words find her way back. He looked down at the baby's face again, still red from crying, still damp with rain, but calm now, like she'd cried herself past the point of fighting and settled into whatever came next. Trusting him, maybe, in the only way a newborn could trust anybody. Just by not screaming. "What am I supposed to do with you?" Hank muttered, and his voice cracked on the last word, embarrassing him even though there was nobody around to hear it but the storm. He thought about Big Jim back at the clubhouse, about how he'd react to this, about protocol and liability and all the reasons this was a bad idea. He thought about child services, about strangers in offices with clipboards deciding where this baby would sleep tonight, about foster homes and case numbers and a little girl becoming a file instead of a person. And then he thought about the handwriting. Something about the shape of the letters snagged at the back of his mind, familiar in a way he couldn't place yet, like a name sitting right on the tip of his tongue. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, lighting up the parking lot bright as day for half a second before the dark rushed back in. Honk made his decision in that flash of light, fast and sure, the way he made most of his decisions, not with his head but with something further down, something that had never steered him wrong when it came to the people who needed him most. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, patting it once like he was making a promise to it. Then he adjusted the baby against his chest, working the zipper of his jacket up as far as it would go without pressing too hard against her, leaving just enough room for her to breathe easy. One night, he said out loud, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore. Himself. The baby. Whoever was watching from somewhere up above the clouds. Just gotta figure some things out first. He swung his leg over his bike, settling into the seat with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent half his life exactly there, one hand steady against the baby's back, the other gripping the throttle. The engine roared to life beneath him, drowning out the thunder for just a moment, and Hank pointed the bike away from the police station, away from the hospital, and straight toward the clubhouse instead. The clubhouse lights cut through the rain like a lighthouse beacon, and Hank gunned the throttle those last few 100 yards, water spraying off his tires. He barely remembered parking the bike. He barely remembered walking to the door. All he could think about was the small, warm weight against his chest and the way her breathing had started to even out, like she'd finally decided he wasn't so bad after all. He shouldered the door open, and the noise inside stopped like someone had thrown a switch. The clubhouse was the same as always. Poker game running in the corner, a couple of prospects cleaning bike parts on newspaper spread across a folding table, the television droning some late-night rerun nobody was really watching. Dutch was leaned back in his usual chair, boots up on a crate, a beer sweating in his hand. Big Jim stood near the bar, going over some paperwork with a pen tucked behind his ear. Every single one of them turned when Hank walked in. He knew what he looked like. Soaked clean through, rain still dripping off his beard, leather jacket dark and heavy with water. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped the room cold. It was the sound coming from inside his jacket, a thin, wavering cry that didn't belong anywhere near a biker clubhouse at midnight. Hank? Dutch was on his feet fast for a man his size, the beer forgotten on the crate beside him. What in the hell? Hank didn't answer right away. He walked further into the room, water pooling under his boots on the old wood floor, and carefully unzipped his jacket enough to reveal the bundle inside. The baby blinked against the sudden light, her small face scrunched up, fists working free of the damp blanket. The room went dead silent. Even the television seemed to fade into the background. Is that, one of the prospects started, then didn't finish the sentence, because there wasn't really any other way to end it. Big Jim set his paperwork down slow, like sudden movements might make the whole scene disappear. He crossed the room with the kind of authority that came from 30 years of leading men who could break bones with their bare hands, and he stopped in front of Hank, studying the baby like he was trying to convince himself she was real. "Where?" Big Jim said, and stopped, choosing his words with more care than Hank had ever heard from him. "Where did you find her?" "Parking lot." grocery store off Route 9. Hank's voice came out rough, scraped raw from the ride and everything else. Shopping cart. Storm was coming down hard, and she was just sitting there, soaked through, crying, alone? Dutch asked, already moving closer, his eyes wide. Alone, Hank shifted his weight, cradling the baby a little tighter. There was a note tucked under her blanket. Big Jim's jaw tightened. "You call the cops?" "Not yet." Hank, Big Jim's voice took on the tone he used when club business needed settling, firm and final. "You gotta call this in right now. Tonight, this isn't something we handle. This is a baby, an actual abandoned infant, and there are people, professionals, whose whole job is dealing with exactly this kind of thing." Around the room, heads were nodding. Even Dutch, who Hank could always count on to back him without question, looked torn, glancing between Hank and Big Jim like he wasn't sure which side of this he was supposed to land on. "Call Child Services," Big Jim continued, already reaching for the phone mounted near the bar. "Or the station. Reyes is on shift tonight. He'll know what to do. He'll treat it right." "This isn't on us, Hank. We can't be the ones deciding what happens to her." Hank stood there, rain still dripping steady off the ends of his hair, and for a second he almost let Big Jim make the call. It would have been easier. It would have been the protocol, the smart thing, the thing that kept the club clean and out of trouble. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket with his free hand and pulled out the note. The ink smeared, but still readable, and held it out like it was the only thing keeping him standing. "Give me one night," Hank said, his voice cracking just slightly on the word night. "Just one night. Before we hand her over to strangers, let me figure out who wrote this." The back room smelled like old coffee and motor oil, but somebody had cleared off the desk and set up a lamp, and that was enough. Hank sat in a folding chair with the baby against his shoulder, her breathing slow, and even now, her tiny fist curled against his collar. Dutch's wife, Marie, had shown up 20 minutes ago in her pajamas and a raincoat, hair still wet, carrying a bag of baby supplies she kept from when their own kids were small. She hadn't asked a single question. She'd just taken one look at the baby, mixed up a bottle from powder she found in her emergency stash, and shown Hank how to hold it at the right angle so the baby wouldn't choke. Then, she'd squeezed his shoulder and left him alone with the door half shut, like she understood he needed a minute that didn't belong to anybody else. Grace. He'd started calling her in his head. Just because he had to call her something. He needed both hands, so he'd tucked the note into his shirt pocket, but now that the bottle was empty and Grace was drowsy and quiet, he pulled it back out. The lamp gave better light than his flashlight had out in the storm. He held the note close, careful not to jostle the baby, and read it again. "Please keep her safe. I love her too much to keep her, but I have nowhere else to turn. Her mother." He'd read those words a dozen times already on the ride back, but something about seeing them now, dry and still under real light, made him look closer. The ink had smeared some from the rain, but the shape of the letters still held. There was a particular way the writer looped her lowercase g's, curling them back on themselves like a little spiral. And the slant of it, tilted hard to the right, urgent, like the handwriting it couldn't move fast enough to keep up with what the heart wanted to say. Hank frowned. He'd seen that slant before. He knew he had. He tried to place it. A supply order somebody left taped to the bar? No, A note from one of the prospect's girlfriends? No, that wasn't it either. He shifted Grace a little in his arms, and she made a small sound in her sleep, a tiny huffing breath, and settled again. Hank stared at the note a while longer, the gears in his head turning slow, the way they always did when he was tired and soaked to the bone and running on fumes. He almost let it go. Almost told himself he was imagining things, that grief and exhaustion could make a man see ghosts in a stranger's handwriting. Then it hit him. It came all at once, the way memory sometimes does, not a slow build, but a wall of water crashing down without warning. Marcus's kitchen table, years ago. Sarah, maybe 12 years old, sitting there with her tongue between her teeth in concentration, writing out a birthday card for her dad's birthday because Marcus had forgotten his own wallet and couldn't buy one. Hank had been there that day, waiting on Marcus to finish getting ready so they could head to the shop together. He remembered leaning over Sarah's shoulder, teasing her about her handwriting, telling her she wrote like she was trying to outrun the words themselves. "You loop your G's funny," he'd told her. "Like little curly fries." She'd laughed and stuck her tongue out at him and kept writing anyway. That same hard slant, that same spiral loop, filling the card with words about how much she loved her dad. Hank's chest went tight. His hands, still holding the note, started to shake, just slightly, just enough that Grace stirred against him and made a small, unhappy noise. He looked down at the baby in his arms. Really looked at her. The dark hair. The shape of her nose, small and slightly upturned. He'd seen that same shape on Marcus's face 1,000 times, laughing across a poker table, gunning his bike down the highway, standing at Sarah's side at every birthday party the club had ever thrown for her growing up. "Oh God," Hank said out loud, to the empty room, to nobody. His voice came out cracked, barely above a whisper. "Oh God, Marcus, this wasn't just some baby left in a shopping cart in a storm. This was Sarah's baby. This was Marcus's granddaughter." Hank sat very still for a long time after that, like moving might break something. The rain kept falling outside, softer now, ticking against the tin roof of the clubhouse in a steady rhythm. He looked at Grace's face until his eyes burned, and then he looked at the note again, and then back at her face like he needed to keep checking. Like the truth might change if he stopped watching it. Marcus's granddaughter. Sleeping in his arms. Left in a shopping cart in a storm. The memories came slow after that first crash of recognition, the way water seeps into a boot instead of pouring in all at once. He remembered Marcus at 19, both of them barely more than kids themselves, wrenching on a busted Harley in Marcus's father's garage, laughing so hard about something stupid that Marcus dropped a socket wrench on his own foot. He remembered Marcus's wedding, long before Sarah was born, Hank standing up as best man in a rented suit that didn't fit right in the shoulders. He remembered the day Sarah came into the world, Marcus pacing the hospital hallway white as a sheet, gripping Hank's arm so hard it left a bruise, saying, "I don't know how to do this, Hank. I don't know how to be somebody's dad." "You'll figure it out," Hank had told him. "You always do." And Marcus had. He'd figured it out better than most men Hank had ever known. He'd raised Sarah with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man built like a linebacker, riding a motorcycle that scared the neighbors half to death. He used to bring her to the clubhouse on Sunday afternoons, let her sit on his knee while the brothers played cards, made sure she called every single one of them uncle even though there wasn't a drop of shared blood between any of them. Then came the accident. Hank's stomach turned over, the same way it always did when his mind dragged him back there. The rivalry with the other club had been simmering for months. Stupid pride and old grudges nobody could quite let go of. Hank had been the one who pushed for the meeting that night, the one who thought they could settle things face to face instead of letting it fester. Marcus had gone along because that's what brothers did. They didn't let each other walk into something alone. The other side brought more anger than sense. Somebody's bike went down wrong on the wet road during the chase that followed, and it had been Marcus's, and it had been over before anyone could do a single thing to stop it. Hank had held him at the end, had told him it was going to be fine, even though some part of him already knew it wasn't. Marcus's last words hadn't been about the club or the rivalry or any of the foolish pride that got them there. He'd said one word, barely a whisper. Sarah. Hank had failed to keep that promise the way he wanted to. He'd gone to the funeral, stood at the back so Sarah wouldn't have to look at the man who led her father into danger, and then he'd let her walk out of his life without a fight. Telling himself it was what she needed, telling himself distance was a kindness. 2 years of silence. 2 years of not knowing where she went, or how she was living, or whether she ever thought about the uncles who used to spoil her on Sunday afternoons. And now here she was again, in the only way she could reach him. Through her daughter, wrapped in a wet blanket, left in a shopping cart during a storm, with a note begging a stranger to keep her safe. Except, Hank wasn't a stranger. Sarah had remembered him. Out of everyone in the world she could have turned to, she picked him. The window across the room had started to lighten by the time Hank realized the storm outside had finally broken. Gray dawn crept in slow, turning the black sky to soft silver, and the rain had thinned to a drizzle before stopping altogether. Grace slept on, her small chest rising and falling against him, peaceful now in a way she hadn't been when he first found her. Hank looked down at her and made a promise. Silent. The kind that didn't need words to be real. I'm going to find your mama, sweetheart. I'm going to find out why she had to leave you in that cart, and I'm going to make sure nobody ever has to make that kind of choice again. I owe your grandpa that much. I owe you more. He stood up slow, careful not to wake her, and carried her out into the main room where the brothers had gathered, waiting for him with tired eyes and coffee going cold in their hands. Big Jim looked up first. Dutch straightened in his chair. We need to talk, Hank said. All of us. There's something you all need to know. The story he told them that morning stripped the room of every ounce of tiredness. Big Jim sat back in his chair, arms crossed, listening without a word until Hank finished, until the whole thing was laid out plain. Marcus, Sarah, the note. The baby now sleeping in a laundry basket, lined with one of Dutch's flannel shirts because they didn't have anything better yet. You're sure it's her handwriting, Big Jim said finally. I'm sure. Nobody argued after that. That was the thing about the club, about brothers who'd ridden together through worse storms than the one last night. Once Hank said he was sure, that settled it. So what do we do? Dutch asked, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. First thing, Hank said, looking down at the basket, she needs supplies. Diapers, formula, actual baby stuff, not whatever we can rig up out of shop rags. That got a few tired laughs, the kind that come easier after a long night when everybody needs something to break the tension. Big Jim sent 2 of the younger guys, Tank and Ray, out to the 24-hour superstore on the highway with a list Hank rattled off from memory. Things he hadn't thought about in years, but that came back to him easy, like riding a bike. Diapers, newborn size. Formula, the powder kind, plus bottles. A pack of onesies. A thermometer. Wipes, a soft blanket that wasn't soaked through with rainwater. They came back 40 minutes later looking shell-shocked, like men who'd just survived a war zone instead of a grocery store. Arms loaded down with bags. They got about 100 kinds of formula, Tank said, setting everything on the table like it might bite him. I didn't know what to get, so I got 3. Cashier asked if we were starting a daycare, Ray added. I told her something like that. Hank almost smiled. Almost he was too tired and too wrung out from the night before. But there was something in the way the brothers moved around that baby now. Careful, gentle, big rough hands fumbling with tiny snaps on a onesie that loosened something tight in his chest. It was Dutch who brought it up first. Sitting at the table with a bottle of formula he was trying to warm the right way. Testing a few drops on his wrist the way he'd seen on some late-night television show years back. We can't keep calling her the baby, he said. Or the case, or whatever you want to call it, if this goes through the system. She's not going through the system, Hank said, sharper than he meant to. I know that. I'm saying she needs a name. Even if it's just for now. Even if it's just until we find Sarah. Hank looked at her, sleeping in the laundry basket, her small fists curled up near her face, and he thought about Marcus, about the word he'd whispered at the end. He thought about Grace, real Grace, the kind that showed up uninvited in the middle of a storm and changed everything. Grace, he said. Her name's Grace. Nobody argued with that either. By mid-afternoon, the clubhouse had turned into something none of them would have believed possible a day before. Diapers stacked on a shelf that used to hold spare parts. A crib borrowed from Ray's sister set up in the back room. Big rough men taking turns holding a bottle, arguing quietly over how many ounces a newborn needed, looking things up on their phones like it was the most natural thing in the world. But Hank knew all that was just buying time. Grace needed more than diapers and borrowed cribs. She needed her mother, and her mother needed to be found before anybody official got wind of a baby with no paperwork sitting in a biker clubhouse. He went out to the porch, where the air still smelled like wet pavement, and pulled out his phone, scrolling until he found the number he was looking for. Officer Mike Reyes. Hank hadn't called that number in 3 years. Not since Reyes retired the favor Hank had done for him back when his kid brother got tangled up with the wrong crowd and needed somebody to vouch for him. Reyes picked up on the 3rd ring, voice groggy with sleep. Morrison? It's barely noon, man. What's going on? I need a favor, Hank said. Quiet one. Nothing official yet. There was a pause on the line, the sound of Reyes sitting up, suddenly awake. What kind of favor? I need you to find somebody for me. A young woman. Sarah Cole, Marcus's daughter. You remember Marcus. I remember. Reyes' voice went careful. What's this about, Hank? I'll explain everything when I see you, Hank said. But I need this kept off the books for now. No report, nothing official, just help me find her before anybody else does. 2 days passed, and the clubhouse stopped feeling like a clubhouse. Somebody had taped a hand-drawn schedule to the refrigerator. Feeding times. Nap times. Whose turn it was to change a diaper. Tank's handwriting was so bad that Ray had to redo half of it, and the two of them argued about it like it was the most important document either had ever signed. You wrote 2 am as 2 p.m., Ray said, jabbing a finger at the paper. So? Grace don't know what time it is. Grace's mama might ask when we find her, and I ain't telling her we run a nursery like a bunch of idiots. Big Jim, who had spent 30 years building a reputation as a man nobody crossed, spent an hour on the second day trying to figure out how to work a baby swing that Ray's sister had dropped off along with the crib. He read the instructions 3 times, muttering under his breath, before Dutch finally leaned over his shoulder. You got it backwards, Jim. I do not have it backwards. The straps go over her shoulders, not under her arms like you're hog-tying a calf. Big Jim's ears went red. But he fixed it, and when Grace finally settled into the swing without crying, he stood back with his arms crossed, and a look on his face like he'd just won a championship fight. The formula situation sorted itself out after the second day, once Honk looked up the right kind online, and Honk drove back out to return the 2 wrong tubs he'd bought in a panic. Warming bottles became a whole production. Somebody had read that you weren't supposed to microwave them, so instead they ran hot water over the bottles in the sink, arguing about how hot was too hot, testing drops on their wrists like a bunch of nervous new fathers, which, in a strange way, they had all become. Diaper changes were their own kind of comedy. Big men who could bench press 300 pounds without breaking a sweat froze up at the sight of a diaper tab, holding Grace at arm's length like she might go off like a bomb. Dutch got the job done fastest, quiet and efficient, and when Hunk asked him how he'd gotten so good at it so quick, Dutch just shrugged. Had a niece once, long time ago. Guess it comes back. Grace didn't seem to mind any of it. She ate, she slept, she cried sometimes in the middle of the night, and every time she did, at least 3 grown men came stumbling out of their rooms to check on her, bumping into each other in the hallway, none of them wanting to be the one who didn't show up. By the second evening, something had shifted in the whole place. The clubhouse still smelled like motor oil and leather, but now it smelled like baby powder too, and nobody complained about that. Rough voices that once shouted over pool tables and poker games had learned to drop low and soft humming tunes none of them could remember the words to, just to get Grace to settle. Hank watched all of it from the edges most of the time, letting his brothers figure it out, letting them fumble their way into something that looked a whole lot like love. It did something to him, watching it. Something he didn't have words for yet. That night, once the last light clicked off down the hall and the clubhouse went quiet except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the wind outside, Hank sat alone in the back room with Grace in his arms. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even awake, really, just drifting in that place between sleep and waking, her small hand wrapped around his finger the way it had been that first night in the storm. Hank looked down at her for a long time before he spoke. "You look like him, you know," he said quietly. "Around the eyes. Your grandpa had eyes just like that. Serious eyes. Even when he was laughing, there was something serious behind them." He shifted her a little, careful, the way he'd learned over the last 2 days, without anybody teaching him. "I should have been there," he said, voice low, rougher than usual. "That day. I should have seen it coming. The other club, the trouble brewing, all of it. I saw the signs and I didn't do enough. And your grandpa paid for it." He stopped, swallowing hard, staring at the wall like Marcus might be standing there listening. "I let your mama down too. Stayed away after the funeral because I didn't know how to look her in the eye. Told myself it was easier that way. Wasn't easier, was just easier for me." Grace stirred. her tiny fingers tightening around his. "I'm not making that mistake again," Hank whispered. "Not with you. Not with her. I promise you that, Grace. Whatever it costs me." The next morning came gray and quiet. Rain still tapping soft against the windows. Hank sat in the garage on an overturned crate, staring at a wrench in his hand like he'd forgotten what it was for. He hadn't touched a bike in 2 days. That alone told Dutch something was wrong. Dutch walked in, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, and stopped when he saw Hank's face. "You look like hell," Dutch said. "Thanks, I mean it. You barely slept, barely ate. What's going on in that head of yours?" Hank didn't answer right away. He turned the wrench over in his hands, watching the dull light catch the metal. "Just thinking," he said. "About Grace? About Marcus." Dutch pulled up another crate and sat down across from him, not saying anything, just waiting the way he always did when he knew Hank needed the silence before the words came. Hank's jaw tightened. "You remember that summer? 2 years back, when the Reapers started pushing into our territory." Dutch nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember. I knew it was getting bad," Hank said. "I saw Marcus getting more careless, taking rides alone when he shouldn't have. I told myself I'd talk to him about it. Kept putting it off." The memory came back to Hank clear as day, the way it always did when he let his guard down. The Reapers' clubhouse burning after a botched retaliation. The shouting matches at the monthly meets. Marcus laughing it off, saying he wasn't scared of a bunch of wannabes on cheap bikes. Hank remembering the night Marcus rode out alone to smooth things over with the Reapers' leader, trying to be the peacemaker like he always was. Hank remembered the phone call. The screech of tires somewhere in his memory, though he hadn't been there to hear it. The Reapers had run Marcus off the road, whether on purpose or by accident, nobody ever proved for sure. And by the time Hank got to the scene, there was nothing left to do but stand in the wreckage and feel his whole world crack open. "I keep going back to that night," Hank said, voice low. "Wondering what would have happened if I rode out with him. If I'd said something sooner. Maybe he'd still be here." Dutch leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You can't carry that, Hank. You know that." "I do carry it," Hank said, sharper than he meant to. "Every day. And after the funeral, when Sarah just disappeared, stopped answering calls, stopped coming around, I let that happen too. Told myself she needed space. Told myself it wasn't my place to chase her down." He shook his head. "Truth is, I didn't know how to look her in the eye. Not after what happened to her daddy. Felt like every time she looked at me, she'd see the man who let him die." "That's not what she saw," Dutch said quietly. "You don't know that." "No," Dutch admitted. "But I know you. And I know you didn't kill Marcus. The Reapers did that. You can hate yourself for not being there, but that's not the same as being the one who did it." Hank stared down at his hands, calloused and scarred from 20 years of road and wrenches, hands that had held Grace so gentle just the night before. "I failed him," Hank said. "And I failed her. Twice now, if you count leaving that baby without a mother for 2 whole days before we found her." Dutch shook his head firm. "You didn't fail Grace. You picked her up out of that storm, and you've kept her safe every second since. And now you got a chance to fix the rest of it too." Hank looked up. "Finding Sarah," Dutch said, "that's not just some job you took on for Marcus's sake. That's your chance to make it right. All of it. The thing with Marcus, the thing with her. You find that girl, you bring her home safe, And maybe you stop carrying around all this weight like it's yours to carry alone." Hank didn't say anything for a long moment. The rain kept falling outside, steady and soft against the garage roof. "I'm gonna find her," Hank finally said. "Whatever it takes." Dutch nodded. "I know you will." The phone rang at 6 in the morning, cutting through the quiet of the clubhouse like a siren. Hank was already awake. He'd been awake most of the night, sitting in the chair next to the crib they'd rigged up out of a dresser drawer and old blankets, watching Grace sleep, listening to her small breaths. He grabbed the phone off the counter before it could ring twice. "Morrison." "Hank." "It's Reyes." The officer's voice was quick, alert, the way it got when he had something. "I think I got a lead on your girl." Hank stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor, and Grace stirred but didn't wake. He lowered his voice anyway. "Talk to me." "One of the guys in my precinct pulled a favor for me, went through some security footage from pharmacies downtown. We got a hit. Young woman, matches Sarah's description, bought a case of baby formula and some diapers at a pharmacy on 5th Street. Paid cash. This was about a week ago." Hank's chest tightened. A week ago. That meant Sarah had been out there, alone, taking care of a baby, before she'd ever left Grace in that shopping cart. Before whatever happened that pushed her to leave her daughter in a storm and disappear. "You got a name of the store?" Hank asked. "Sunrise Pharmacy. Corner of 5th and Miller. I'll text you the address. I owe you, Reyes. You already paid that debt a long time ago," Reyes said. "Just find her. And Hank, be careful how you go about this. If there's something scaring her enough to leave her baby with a biker in a storm, it ain't nothing small." Hank hung up and stood there for a second, staring at the phone in his hand like it might tell him more if he waited long enough. Then, he went to find Dutch. Dutch was in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, still half asleep. Hank didn't waste words. Got a lead. Pharmacy downtown. Sarah was there a week ago, buying formula. Dutch set the mug down without drinking from it. "Let's go." They took Hank's bike, riding through the wet morning streets with the sun barely cutting through the clouds. The city was waking up slow. Shop owners rolling up metal gates, delivery trucks idling at curbs. Sunrise Pharmacy sat on the corner like it had for probably 30 years, a faded sign and a bell over the door that jingled when Hank pushed it open. The woman behind the counter looked up, and her eyes went a little wide at the sight of two big bikers walking in, leather jackets and all. Hank tried to soften his face, the way he did with Grace, though it didn't come as natural with strangers. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Wondering if you might remember a customer." Young woman, brown hair, probably looked tired. Bought formula and diapers about a week back. The woman hesitated, glancing between Hank and Dutch like she was deciding whether to trust them. Dutch, sensing it, gave her his easiest smile. "We're not here to cause trouble," Dutch said. "We're trying to help her. She's got family looking for her." That seemed to loosen something in the woman's shoulders. She nodded slowly. "I remember her. Sweet girl, but she looked scared, kept looking over her shoulder like she thought someone might be watching her. Paid in cash, counted out every dollar like she didn't have much to spare." "She say anything?" Hank asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Not much. She was quiet. But I remember when she was leaving, she mumbled something to herself. I almost didn't catch it." The woman paused, like she was pulling the memory up from somewhere. She said she needed to find somewhere safe. "That's all." Somewhere safe. Hank felt those words settle into his chest like stones dropping into water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood about why Sarah had left her baby behind. Somewhere safe. Not somewhere better. Not somewhere easier. Safe, Dutch looked over at Hank, and Hank could see his own worry mirrored back at him. Did she say where she was going? Anything about a shelter? A friend's place? Anything? Hank asked. The woman shook her head. No. She just paid and left. Looked like she was in a hurry. Hank thanked her, and they stepped back out onto the sidewalk, the morning air cool against his face. He stood there a moment, staring down the street like it might give him an answer. Somewhere safe, Dutch repeated quietly. From what, though? That question hung between them the whole ride back to the clubhouse. Hank didn't have an answer, not yet, but he had a feeling settling low in his gut. The kind of feeling that came from 20 years of reading trouble before it showed its face. Somebody was scaring Sarah. Somebody had put that look in her eyes that made a pharmacy clerk remember her a week later. The next 2 days blurred together into a routine of knocking on doors and showing a photograph that Big Jim had dug up from an old picture Marcus kept in his wallet. A photo of Sarah at maybe 19, smiling. Her hair different, but her eyes the same. Hank carried it in his jacket pocket like it was something sacred. They started in the neighborhoods closest to the pharmacy, walking into laundromats and corner stores, diners with sticky menus and tired waitresses. Hank learned to soften his approach, to lead with Dutch's easy charm before he said a word, because his own size and the leather and the patches on his back made people nervous before he even opened his mouth. "We ain't cops," Dutch would say first, holding his hands up a little, palms out. Family's worried about her, that's all. Trying to help, not hurt. Most people shook their heads. Some didn't even look at the photo, just waved them off like they didn't want the trouble of being involved. But a few remembered something. A bus driver on Miller Street thought he'd seen her getting off near the community center, walking fast, keeping her head down. A woman at a laundromat said she'd seen a girl matching that description crying in the corner booth of a diner, alone. No baby with her, which meant this was before Grace ended up in that shopping cart. Before the storm. By the second day, a pattern started forming in Hank's mind, the way pieces of an engine start making sense once you've had your hands in it long enough. Sarah wasn't broke and desperate the way people got when money ran out. She was hiding. Every person who remembered her said the same thing in different words. She looked over her shoulder. She flinched at loud noises. She left too much change on the counter because she wanted to get out the door fast, not because she wasn't paying attention. "Somebody's after her," Hunk said to Dutch as they sat outside a shelter on the east side, the third one they'd visited that day. The building was brick, plain, with a chain-link fence around a small yard where a few kids played on a rusted swing set. Not money trouble. A person. Dutch nodded slow, chewing on the inside of his cheek the way he did when he was thinking hard. Makes sense why she left the baby the way she did then, not because she couldn't handle it, because she was running from something, and she couldn't run fast enough with a newborn in her arms. Hank felt something twist tight in his chest, the shape of an old guilt mixing with a new fear. He thought of Marcus, of what his friend would say if he knew his little girl had been running scared through the city with nowhere to turn. He thought about the note again, the smeared ink, the words that made more sense now than they had that first stormy night. "I have nowhere else to turn." They walked up to the shelter's front door. A woman answered, middle-aged, tired eyes but a kind face, wearing a name tag that said Connie. Hank held out the photo, same as he had a dozen times already. "We're looking for this woman," he said. "Name's Sarah. She might have come through here, maybe with a baby, maybe without." Connie's eyes flicked to the photo, and something changed in her face. It was brief, just a flicker, but Hank caught it the way he caught engine trouble by sound alone. Recognition. She knew something. "I can't discuss who comes through our doors," Connie said, her voice careful. "Practiced. We have a strict confidentiality policy here. It's for the safety of the women we help." "We're not here to cause her trouble," Hank said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he did with Grace when she cried in the middle of the night. "Her family's looking for her. Real family. I knew her daddy. I just want to know she's safe." Connie studied him for a long moment, glancing between Hank and Dutch like she was weighing something heavy in her mind. Finally, she sighed. "If I see her," Connie said slowly, "I'll tell her you're looking. That's all I can promise." The clubhouse smelled like coffee and bacon grease when Hank walked in the next morning, his boots heavy from another night of sleep that never really came. Grace was in Big Jim's arms by the kitchen counter, wrapped in one of the flannel shirts they'd folded into a makeshift blanket because nobody had thought to buy real baby blankets yet. Big Jim, a mountain of a man with a beard gone mostly gray, held her like she was made of glass. "She's been fussy," Big Jim said, not looking up. "Wouldn't take the bottle right." "Let me try," Hank said, reaching out his arms. Dutch was already at the stove, scrambling eggs in a pan too small for the job, humming some tune Hank didn't recognize. A few other members sat around the long table, Tank and Whiskers, and a prospect named Ollie, who still looked like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be in the room. All of them had one eye on their coffee and one eye on the baby, the way men do when they're pretending not to care about something they care about very much. Hank settled into the old recliner by the window, the one with the stuffing coming out of the left armrest, and held Grace against his chest. She squirmed, her tiny face scrunched up in that way that usually came before a cry. But then, she stopped. Her dark eyes, still that unfocused newborn blue-gray, drifted up toward his face. "Hey there," Hank said, voice low and rough. The same voice he used to calm spooked horses at a friend's ranch years back. "You're all right. You're safe." Grace's mouth twitched. Just a little at first, a flicker at the corner of her lips. Then it spread, slow and unmistakable, into something that was, without question, a smile. "Whoa," Dutch said, dropping his spatula onto the stove with a clatter. "Did she just?" "She smiled," Big Jim said, and his voice cracked a little on the word, which was a strange thing to hear from a man his size. "Hank," she smiled. The whole room seemed to lean in at once. Tank stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Whiskers came around the table, and even Ollie forgot to be nervous, crowding in close with the rest of them to look at this tiny person who had just done something so small and so enormous at the same time. "Do it again," Tank said. Like Grace was a trick he wanted repeated. "She ain't a jukebox," Dutch said. But he was grinning too, wide and unguarded, the kind of grin that didn't show up on him often. Hank looked down at Grace, and something loosened in his chest, some knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since that stormy night in the parking lot. He thought about Marcus, about how his friend would have laughed to see a room full of grown bikers gathered around a baby like she was the most important thing in the world. Maybe she was. "That's for you, old friend," Honk said quietly, so quiet only he could hear it. "That's for you." The morning rolled on that way, warm and easy, the search for Sarah humming along in the background through phone calls Dutch made from the back office and texts that came in from Officer Reyes checking in on leads. But for an hour, nobody in that room was thinking about missing persons or abusive boyfriends or court papers. They were just thinking about a baby's first smile, and how it had turned a clubhouse full of hardened men soft in a way none of them would ever admit to a stranger. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when Hank's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer it fast. "This is Hank," he said. "Mr. Morrison. This is Connie, from the shelter." Her voice was different than it had been on the porch, warmer, less guarded. "I found her. I talked to Sarah last night." Hank's grip tightened on the phone. "Is she all right?" "She's all right," Connie said. "She cried when I told her Grace was safe. Cried for a long time, actually. She wants to see you. She's agreed to meet you at the shelter tomorrow morning." Hank rode alone to the shelter the next morning, leaving his brothers back at the clubhouse with Grace and a long list of instructions about her bottle schedule that Big Jim had written down like it was a matter of national security. The sky was clear now, washed clean from the storm 2 days before, but Hank's hands still felt shaky on the handlebars, like the storm was still inside him somewhere. The shelter was a plain brick building on a quiet street, the kind of place you'd drive past 100 times and never notice. There were no signs out front, no markings that gave away what it was. Hank understood why. Places like this needed to stay hidden. Lives depended on it. Connie met him at the door, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who studied him for a long moment before letting him in. "She's nervous," Connie said. "Give her time." "I got all the time she needs," Hank said. The visitation room was small and plain, just a table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto a fenced yard. Hank sat down and folded his big hands together on the table, trying to make himself look smaller, less like a man who rode with a motorcycle club, more like someone Sarah could trust. He'd taken off his leather cut that morning, left it hanging in his closet, though it felt strange to walk anywhere without it. He didn't want her first look at him after 2 years to be all patches and leather. He wanted her to see Marcus's friend. Just that. The door opened, and Sarah walked in. Hank's chest tightened at the sight of her. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheeks hollowed out in a way that spoke of nights without enough sleep or food. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and there was a fading bruise along her jaw that she hadn't quite managed to cover with makeup. Her eyes, though, those were the same. Marcus's eyes. Dark and warm, even now, even exhausted. The second she saw Hank, her face crumpled, and tears started falling before she even said a word. "Hank," she whispered, like his name was something fragile. He stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor, and then she was moving toward him, fast, like her legs had made the decision before her mind caught up. She collapsed into his arms, and Hank wrapped them around her without hesitation, the way he might have caught her if she were falling. She sobbed against his chest, her whole body shaking, and Hank just held her, one big hand smoothing over her hair the way he used to do when she was a little girl, and skinned her knee at the clubhouse picnics. "I'm sorry," she kept saying, over and over, the words broken up by gasping breaths. "I'm so sorry, Hank. I'm sorry. Hey now, Hank said, his voice low and steady even though his own eyes were stinging. You don't gotta be sorry. You hear me? Not to me. I didn't abandon her, Sarah said, pulling back just enough to look up at him, her face wet and desperate. I need you to know that. I need you to believe me. I believe you, Hank said. I read your note. I know he was going to take her, Sarah said. The words tumbling out now, fast and frantic, like she'd been holding them in for too long and they'd finally broken free. Derek. If I tried to leave, he said he'd take Grace and disappear. He said I'd never see her again. He's done it before, Hank. He took my phone once for 2 weeks. He wouldn't let me talk to anybody. He'd get so angry over nothing. And I was scared. I was so scared he'd hurt her, or hurt me worse than he already had, and I didn't know what else to do. Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hand to her mouth like she was trying to hold back another sob. I remembered you, she whispered. I remembered how kind you always were to me and Dad. I knew if I could just get her to you, she'd be safe. I knew you'd take care of her. Hank guided Sarah back to the chair, easing her down like she was made of glass. He pulled his own chair closer, so their knees almost touched, and he kept one of her hands wrapped up in both of his. Her fingers were cold, even though the room wasn't. Take your time, he said. I ain't going anywhere. Sarah wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, took a shaky breath, and nodded. It didn't start out bad, she said. Derek was charming, you know. He said all the right things. Told me he'd take care of me and the baby. I was alone after Dad died, Hank. I didn't have anybody. You all disappeared, and I don't blame you. I know it was hard for everybody. But I was so alone. Hank's jaw tightened at that. It was a knife twisting slow, hearing how his own grief and shame had left this girl to fend for herself when Marcus would have wanted them watching over her. I should have come around, Hank said quietly. That's on me. It's not, Sarah said. It's not anybody's fault but his. It got bad slow. Like a frog in water, you know that saying? By the time I noticed it was boiling, I was already stuck. He didn't hit me at first. First it was just words. Telling me I was stupid, telling me nobody else would want me, telling me I was lucky he stayed. Then, when I got pregnant, he got worse. Angrier. Like the baby was something he had to compete with for my attention. She looked down at their hands, and Hank saw her throat working like she was trying to swallow something bitter. After Grace was born, it got real bad. She went on. He hit me the first time when she was 2 weeks old. I still don't even remember what set him off. And every time after, he'd cry and say sorry and swear it would never happen again. And I believed him. Because what else was I supposed to do? I had a newborn and no money and no family. You had family, Hank said, his voice rough. You just didn't know it no more. Sarah's eyes filled again, but she pushed forward. 2 weeks ago he told me if I ever tried to leave, he'd take Grace and I'd never see her again. He knows people. Hank, bad people. I believed he could do it. So I started planning. I didn't tell anybody, not even the shelter people at first, because I was scared he'd find out. How'd you know where to find me? Hank asked. I remembered the route, Sarah said. Dad used to talk about it all the time, how you all rode the same roads back from supply runs, past that grocery store. I used to ride in your sidecar past there when I was little, remember? I figured if I left her right at that spot, during a storm, when nobody else would be out, you'd find her. I know it sounds crazy. I know I took a risk. But I trusted you more than I trusted anybody else in this whole world." Hank felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been closed up tight for 2 years. "You did right," he said. "You hear me? You did right by that baby. Took more guts than most people got, doing what you did." "I was so scared," Sarah whispered. "Leaving her there in the rain, walking away, not knowing for sure if you'd come by in time. I almost turned back a dozen times." "But you didn't," Hank said. "And she's safe. She's warm, she's fed. She's got about 10 grown men fighting over whose turn it is to hold her. Big Jim's got a whole schedule written out for her bottles like he's running a military operation." That got a small, wet laugh out of Sarah, the first real sound of relief Hank had heard from her. "I want you to hear something," Hank said, leaning in, holding her hand tighter. "You and that baby are never going to be alone again. Not while I got breath in me. Not while there's a single brother left in that clubhouse. We're going to get the paperwork done here, get you cleared to leave this place, and tomorrow morning, you're coming home. Both of you. To people who love you." Sarah searched his face like she was afraid to believe it, then nodded, slow and small. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "Tomorrow," Hank said. "I'll be here first thing, and then we go get our girl." The morning sun broke through the clouds like it knew something good was about to happen. Hank pulled his bike up to the shelter right at 8, just like he promised, with Dutch riding beside him on his own Harley, engine rumbling low and steady. Sarah was waiting outside the front doors, a small bag of belongings slung over her shoulder. She looked different than she had the night before. Still tired, still thin in the face, but there was something new in her eyes. Something that looked a little bit like hope. "You ready?" Hank asked, swinging off his bike. Sarah nodded. "More ready than I've been in a long time." Dutch tipped his head toward her, gruff as ever but with a softness underneath. "Got a helmet for you right here, darlin'. Gonna have you ride with Hank. Smoother ride than mine, and my back tire's been squeaking something awful." Sarah managed a small laugh at that, and Hank felt something loosen in his chest at the sound of it. The ride back to the clubhouse took 20 minutes, and Sarah held on tight to Hank's jacket the whole way, her face pressed against his back like she was soaking in the wind and the sunlight and the freedom of it all. When they pulled through the clubhouse gates, Sarah's breath caught. Someone had strung up a banner across the front of the building, hand-painted letters that read "Welcome Home, Sarah A.N.D. Grace." It wasn't fancy. The letters were crooked in places, like whoever painted it had never held a paintbrush before. But it was done with care, and Sarah's hand flew to her mouth when she saw it. The whole chapter was gathered in the yard. Big Jim stood at the front, arms crossed over his chest, but there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Behind him, a dozen leather-clad bikers stood waiting, men who looked like they could tear a phone book in half, all of them grinning like kids on Christmas morning. And there, cradled carefully in the arms of a biker named Rooster, was Grace. Sarah didn't wait for Hank to help her off the bike. She practically threw herself down, stumbling a little in her hurry, and crossed the yard in a rush. "Easy now," Rooster said, gentle as anything, handing the baby over like she was made of spun glass. "Been asking for her mama all morning. Well, she ain't said words yet, but I could tell." Sarah gathered Grace into her arms, and the sound that came out of her was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. She pressed her face into the baby's soft hair, breathing her in, and Grace let out a happy little coo, her small fist reaching up to grab a piece of Sarah's hair. "My baby," Sarah whispered, over and over. My baby, I'm here now." Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling too, smiling so wide it looked like it might hurt. Around her, the bikers had gone quiet, more than a few of them wiping at their own eyes and pretending they weren't. Hank stood back a little, watching it all, and felt Marcus's presence beside him like a warm hand on his shoulder. This was it. This was what he'd fought for. This was the promise kept. Big Jim stepped forward and clapped Hank on the back. "Good work, brother," he said quietly. "Good work." Someone had set up a table with coffee and donuts, and the club started to relax into easy conversation, everybody taking turns getting a look at Grace, everybody wanting to welcome Sarah properly. For a few minutes, it felt like the whole world had righted itself. Like 2 years of grief and guilt had finally found their resolution in this one bright, ordinary morning. That was when the engine roared through the quiet. It came from beyond the gates, loud and aggressive, tires screeching against pavement. Sarah's head snapped up, her whole body going rigid, the color draining from her face in an instant. "That's him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's Derek." The gate rattled hard as something slammed against it. Then came the shouting, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Get out here right now, or I swear to God I'm calling child services. You abandoned that baby, you hear me? I got proof. You're not getting away with this." Hank's whole body went cold and hard, like something inside him had turned to stone. He looked at Sarah once, saw the terror written plain across her face, and then he moved. "Stay inside," he told her, his voice low but firm. "Take Grace to the back room." Now, Sarah didn't argue. She clutched Grace tight to her chest and backed toward the clubhouse door, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. Rooster went with her, standing between her and the yard like a wall of leather and muscle. Hank walked toward the gate. Dutch fell into step beside him, and Big Jim came up on his other side, along with 3 more club members who'd gone quiet and serious the second they heard Derek's voice. Hank pulled the gate open himself. Derek stood there, a wiry man with slicked back hair and a jean jacket that looked too new, like he was trying too hard to look tough. His eyes were wild, darting between the bikers in front of him, but his mouth kept moving, kept running like he thought words alone could win this fight. "There he is," Derek said, jabbing a finger at Hank. "You're the one who's been hiding her, huh? You think you can just take my kid and my girl and nobody's gonna come looking?" "She's not your kid," Hank said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it, sharp as a blade. "And she's not your girl. Not anymore." Derek's face twisted. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, waving it around like a weapon. "You see this? This is proof. This is her handwriting. Right here. She wrote this note and left that baby in a shopping cart in the middle of a storm. That's abandonment. That's a crime. I already talked to a lawyer, and once I show this to child services, she's done. She's finished. That kid's coming with me." That note, Hank said slowly, was a mother trying to protect her daughter from a man who beats her. "You want to talk about crimes? Let's talk about that." Derek's eyes flashed. "You don't know anything." "I know enough," Hank said. Dutch stepped forward then, holding up both hands, palms out, trying to smooth things over the way he always did. "Look, man," he said, keeping his voice easy. "Nobody wants trouble here. Why don't you just turn around, go on home, cool off a little? This isn't the way to handle this." "Don't tell me how to handle my own family," Derek snapped. "She's not your family," Dutch said. "Not anymore. And that baby never was." That was when Derek shoved him. It happened fast, faster than anyone expected. Derek's hand slammed into Dutch's chest, hard enough to knock him back a step, his boots scraping against the gravel. Dutch caught his balance, and for a second, the whole yard seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. A few of the club members surged forward, fists curling, but Hank threw out an arm, stopping them cold. "Nobody touches him," Hank said, his voice like iron. "Nobody." Derek was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his eyes wide like he'd surprised even himself with what he'd just done. But there was something ugly underneath the surprise, too, something that looked like he was ready to do it again. Hank pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were steady, even though his heart was hammering. "What are you doing?" Derek demanded. "Calling the police," Hank said. "What? Why? I didn't do anything, You just assaulted a man in front of 6 witnesses," Hank said. "And you're standing outside a private residence, screaming threats. I want this on record. All of it." Derek's face went pale. "You can't do that. This is between me and Sarah. This doesn't concern you, it concerns all of us now," Big Jim said, stepping up beside Hank, his arms crossed over his broad chest. Hank put the phone to his ear, and when the dispatcher answered, he kept his voice calm and clear, the way he always did when things got serious. "Yeah, I need an officer out here. There's a man threatening a woman and her baby, and he just assaulted someone in front of me. I want it documented." Derek took a step back, his bravado cracking at the edges, but his eyes stayed locked on the gate, on the clubhouse behind it, like he still thought there was some way to get what he wanted. The sirens came first, cutting through the wet evening air, red and blue lights bouncing off the wet gravel of the clubhouse yard. 2 police cruisers pulled up outside the gate, and Hank felt his stomach tighten as he watched the doors open. Officer Reyes stepped out of the first car. Hank recognized him right away, that steady walk, the way he took in a scene before he ever said a word. Reyes had a younger officer with him, a woman with sharp eyes and her hand resting near her belt, ready for anything. "Evening, Hank," Reyes said, his voice even. His eyes flicked to Derek, then to the folded paper still clutched in the man's fist. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on here?" Derek didn't wait to be asked twice. He rushed forward, waving the note like a flag. "Officer, thank God. This woman abandoned her baby, left her in a shopping cart in a storm. I got proof right here, her own handwriting. That's a crime, right? That's abandonment. I want my daughter back, and I want this woman arrested." "She's not your daughter," Hank said again, his voice low but firm. "Sir, I need you to step back," the younger officer said, holding up a hand toward Derek. Derek didn't listen. He kept talking, kept pointing, his words tumbling out fast and desperate, like if he just said enough, everyone would have to believe him. The clubhouse door opened, and Sarah stepped out, Grace bundled tight against her chest. Rooster stood close behind her, but Sarah's face had gone white as milk, her eyes darting from Derek to the officers to Hank. Her hands were shaking. "Ma'am," Reyes said gently, turning toward her. "Are you Sarah?" Sarah nodded, but no words came out. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground would hold. I need you to know your rights, Reyes said. Anything you say can be used later on. But right now, I just need to understand what happened. She left her baby in a parking lot. Derek shouted again. In the middle of a storm. You going to arrest her or not? Sir, if you don't lower your voice, I'm going to ask you to leave, the younger officer said sharply. Sarah's breath came fast and shallow. I didn't abandon her, she said, her voice cracking. I left her with Hank. I knew he'd keep her safe. I couldn't stay with Derek anymore. He was going to hurt us both. I didn't know what else to do. That's not what the note says, Derek snapped, shoving the paper toward Reyes. Read it yourself. She says she can't keep her. That's abandonment. Plain and simple. Reyes took the note carefully, his eyes scanning the smudged ink. His jaw tightened as he read it, and when he looked up, his gaze softened as it landed on Sarah. This isn't the same as walking away and leaving a child to fend for herself, Reyes said slowly. This looks like a woman in a desperate situation trying to protect her child the only way she knew how. That's not how the law sees it, Derek said. But his voice had lost some of its heat now, replaced by something closer to panic. That's not for you to decide, Big Jim said flatly. Reyes rubbed a hand over his jaw, looking between Sarah, Derek, and Hank. Look, he said finally, this isn't as simple as I'd like it to be. There's a note. There's a baby who was left without a formal custody transfer, and there's accusations flying every which way. I'm not in a position to decide who's right and who's wrong tonight. So what happens now? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I'm going to need statements from everyone here, Reyes said. You, Derek, Hank, anybody else who saw or heard anything. He turned to Sarah again, his voice gentler now. And you're probably going to need to go in front of a judge. Get this custody situation sorted out proper, so nobody can come back later and say it wasn't handled right. Sarah's arms tightened around Grace, her eyes filling with tears. Am I going to lose her? Reyes didn't answer right away. He looked at the baby, then back at Sarah, his face unreadable. That's not for me to say, he said quietly. That's up to the judge. The cruisers pulled away, one carrying Derek, who was still shouting something through the window that nobody could hear anymore. The second one held Officer Reyes and his partner headed off to file the paperwork that would decide so much. The gravel yard grew quiet again. But it was a heavy kind of quiet. The kind that presses down on a person's chest. Dutch sat on the porch steps holding a rag to his split lip, where Derek had shoved him hard enough to knock him into the porch rail. He waved off anybody who tried to fuss over him. I'm fine, he kept saying. Worry about her. Nobody had to ask who he meant. Inside the clubhouse, the mood had gone gray. The bikers who usually filled the place with loud laughter and louder music sat quiet at the long wooden table, nursing coffee instead of beer. Big Jim stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the empty road like Derek might come back. Rooster paced by the door. Even the old jukebox in the corner sat silent, like it knew better than to play anything cheerful tonight. Hank stood apart from all of them, near the fireplace, staring into the dark hearth like it might have answers hidden in the ashes. His hands, so steady when he'd held Grace through countless nights, were curled into fists now. He kept hearing Reyes's voice. That's up to the judge. It sounded too much like another voice. From another time. A voice that had told him, 2 years ago, that there was nothing more they could do for Marcus. that some things, once they went wrong, couldn't be put back right no matter how hard a man wished. Hank had believed that once. He'd let that belief eat away at him for 2 years, quiet and rotting, like rust under paint. He wasn't about to believe it again, but standing there, watching Sarah pace the hallway with Grace held so tight against her chest like she was afraid the world might snatch her away, he felt that old fear rising up in his throat, thick and choking. I failed him once. I can't fail him again. He walked down the hallway and found Sarah in the small back bedroom, the one they'd fixed up special for Grace, with a crib made of spare wood and love. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, Grace asleep against her shoulder, her small chest rising and falling in that soft, steady rhythm only babies seem to know how to do, no matter what storm rages around them. Sarah looked up when Hank stepped inside. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry now, like she'd cried herself past tears and out the other side into something colder and more frightened. "They're going to take her from me," she whispered. "Aren't they? Because of that note. Because I left her with you." Hank lowered himself into the old rocking chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight. "No," he said. "They're not. You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "I don't. Not for certain." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking her straight in the eye the way he used to look at Marcus when they'd talk about something that mattered. "But I know this. I'm not gonna let some piece of paper and some sorry excuse of a man decide what kind of mother you are. Not while I've got breath in me." Sarah's lip trembled. "Derek's got money for lawyers. I've got nothing." "You've got me," Hank said. "You've got this whole club. You've got Reyes, who already looked at that note and saw it for what it was. You've got a shelter full of records showing what that man did to you. That's not nothing, Sarah. That's a mountain of truth. And truth's got a way of winning out, long as somebody's willing to dig it up and put it in front of the right eyes." She looked down at Grace, brushing a thumb gently over the baby's small hand. "Dad would know what to do," she whispered. "Your dad," Hank said, his voice rough, "would tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. That family finds a way. That we don't quit when things get hard. We dig in harder." He reached over and rested his big, weathered hand over hers, careful and gentle despite its size. "We've got time before that hearing. I'm gonna spend every hour of it gathering everything we need. Statements, records, whatever it takes. Derek's not walking away from this clean. Not while I'm still standing." The next 2 days moved like a freight train, and Hank stood right at the front of it, driving forward with a kind of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Officer Reyes called on the first morning, his voice low and careful over the phone. "Got something," he said. "You sitting down?" "Just tell me, Reyes. Derek's got a record. Not a long one, but it's there. 2 domestic violence complaints filed against him in the last 3 years. Both dropped before they went to trial." Reyes paused. "You know how that goes. Women get scared. Boyfriends promise to change. Cases fall apart." Hank gripped the phone tighter. "Can you get the actual reports?" "Already pulled them. There's an officer's notes from the second complaint, real detailed. Bruising on the victim's arm. Description matches what Sarah's been telling you about her own experience almost word for word." Reyes's voice hardened. "This isn't a good man who made one mistake, Hank. This is a pattern." "Send me everything you got," Hank said. "And Reyes, I owe you." "You don't owe me nothing," Reyes said. "Just get that girl and her baby somewhere safe for good." That's payment enough. By the afternoon, Dutch had tracked down the shelter where Sarah had been staying before everything came to a head. The volunteer who'd worked closest with her, a soft-spoken woman named Carol with silver hair and kind eyes, agreed to meet with Hank in the shelter's small office, cluttered with donated toys and stacks of paperwork. "Sarah came to us scared out of her mind," Carol said, folding her hands on the desk. First week, she barely spoke above a whisper, flinched every time a door slammed. She shook her head, remembering she told me things about what he did to her. Not just words either. She had marks on her when she came in. I documented them, took photos, like we do with everyone. "Would you testify to that?" Hank asked. "In court?" Carol didn't hesitate. "I've testified before. I'll do it again. That girl loves her daughter more than anything I've ever seen. She didn't abandon that baby out of not caring. She did it because she was terrified of what Derek would do if he found them together." Carol's eyes went hard. "I've seen women die from staying with men like that. I won't watch the system punish her for trying to save her own life." Hank thanked her, feeling something ease in his chest for the first time in days. Piece by piece, the truth was building itself into something solid, something nobody could tear down with a stack of lawyers and a smug smile. That evening, back at the clubhouse, Reyes called again with one more piece of the puzzle. "There's a lawyer," he said. "Name's Patricia Alvarez. Does family law, mostly custody cases. She's tough, and she's got a soft spot for cases like this. I sent her over what we've got so far. She wants to meet you." The next morning, Hank rode alone to Alvarez's office downtown, a small building squeezed between a dry cleaner and a bakery that smelled like fresh bread even from the sidewalk. He felt out of place walking through the glass doors in his leather vest, but the receptionist just smiled and waved him back without so much as a raised eyebrow. Patricia Alvarez was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, sitting behind a desk stacked high with folders. She looked Hank over once, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Officer Reyes tells me, you've got quite a story," she said. Hank told her everything. The storm, the trolley, the note. Sarah's fear and Derek's threats and the record Reyes had pulled showing the pattern of abuse. He laid the papers Carol had given him on the desk, along with the photographs and the shelter's documentation. Alvarez read through it all in silence, her face giving nothing away. When she finally looked up, something had shifted in her eyes. "This isn't a woman who abandoned her child," she said. "This is a woman who was fighting to survive and did the only thing she could to keep her daughter safe." "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone," Hank said. "I'll take the case," Alvarez said. "No charge. Men like Derek make my blood boil, and women like Sarah deserve better than what the system usually gives them." She flipped through her calendar. "Hearing set for 3 days from now. That gives us just enough time to build this properly." The clubhouse smelled like coffee and fried chicken, and somebody had strung up a string of Christmas lights across the back wall even though it was nowhere near Christmas. Big Jim said they made the place feel less like a garage and more like a home. Tonight, Hank figured they needed all the home they could get. Sarah sat on the old couch with Grace asleep against her chest, her knees pulled up tight, like she was trying to make herself smaller. She hadn't touched her plate of food. Hank noticed things like that now. He noticed a lot of things about her, the way she flinched less than she used to, the way her eyes still darted toward the door every time it opened. "You should eat something," he said, sitting down across from her on an overturned crate. "I can't." Her voice was thin. "Hank, what if they don't believe me? What if the judge looks at that note and just sees a mother who threw her baby away? That's not what happened. I know that. You know that. But a judge in a courtroom who's never met me?" She shook her head, and her eyes filled up fast, the way they did when the fear got too big to hold back. Derek's good at lying. He's good at making people believe him. He did it to me for 2 years. Hank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Sarah, look at me." She did, reluctant, like she expected to find doubt in his face. She didn't find it. "You got Carol testifying. You got police records showing exactly what kind of man Derek is. You got a lawyer who believes you so much she's doing this for free. And you got a note in your own handwriting that any decent person can read and understand exactly what kind of mother writes something like that." He paused. A scared one. A brave one. Not a woman who didn't care. Across the room, Dutch had been listening, and he ambled over with a paper plate of chicken, setting it down next to Sarah like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Girl, you ain't going through this alone tomorrow. Half this clubhouse is gonna be sitting in that courtroom. You'll look up and see nothing but faces who already know the truth." "Damn right," Big Jim called from across the room, raising his coffee mug like a toast. "Derek's gonna walk in there thinking he's got the upper hand, and he's gonna walk out wondering what hit him." A few of the other men laughed, low and warm, and one of them, a big guy named Cotton with a beard down to his chest, leaned over and said, "You're family now, Sarah, Marcus's girl. That makes you ours too." Sarah looked around the room at all these rough, tattooed men who'd spent the last week learning how to warm bottles and change diapers without complaint, and something in her face cracked open, not with fear this time, but with something like disbelief that turned slowly into gratitude. She held Grace a little tighter and let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you." Hank just nodded, because there wasn't much more to say that mattered more than being there. Later, after the clubhouse had gone quiet and most everyone had turned in for the night, Hank climbed onto his bike and rode out into the dark. The cemetery was empty this time of night, the gates technically locked, but Hank knew a spot in the fence where the metal had rusted through, same as he'd known it for 2 years now. Marcus's headstone was simple, just a name and 2 dates, the grass around it neatly trimmed because Hank came out here more often than he ever told anyone. He crouched down, resting one hand flat against the cool stone. "Tomorrow's the day," Hank said quietly. "Gonna fight for your girl and your granddaughter in front of a judge who don't know either of them from strangers on the street." He paused, looking up at the dark sky. "I know I let you down before. I know I wasn't fast enough, wasn't smart enough to stop what happened to you. I've carried that a long time, Marcus." The wind moved through the trees, soft and steady. "But I'm not gonna let that happen again. Not to Sarah. Not to that baby girl." Hank's voice grew firm. "Whatever it takes tomorrow, I'll do it. You have my word on that, same as I gave you my word 20 years ago when we first rode together." He stayed a while longer, saying nothing else, just sitting with the quiet and the stars and the weight finally starting to lift off his shoulders. The courthouse hallway was cold, all marble and echoes, nothing like the warmth of the clubhouse. Sarah sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, her hands twisted together in her lap. She'd worn the only nice dress she owned, a blue one that hung a little loose on her now. Hank sat beside her in a clean button-up shirt that Dutch had loaned him feeling like his neck was being choked by the collar he wasn't used to wearing. "You ready?" Hank asked. "No," Sarah said honestly. "But I don't think I'll ever be ready. Let's just go." Behind them, filling nearly every seat in the hallway, sat a dozen Hell's Angels in their best clothes, looking like a wall of leather and quiet determination. Big Jim gave Sarah a small nod as she stood. Dutch squeezed her shoulder once, gentle, like he was afraid of breaking something precious. Inside the courtroom, Derek sat at the other table, dressed sharp in a suit that didn't fit who he really was. His lawyer was a slick man with a shiny watch, and he stood up first when the judge called the hearing to order. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, "we have here a mother who left her infant daughter alone, in a shopping cart, in the middle of a thunderstorm. This note," he held up a photocopy, waving it like a flag, "proves she willingly abandoned this child. My client, Mr. Derek Hayes, has grave concerns about the fitness of Miss Sarah's judgment and stability. He's simply asking the court to consider what's best for the child." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, studied the note without expression. "Continue. This is a woman," the lawyer went on, "who has bounced between locations, who has no stable job, no permanent address. My client is prepared to offer stability that she cannot." Sarah's hands trembled under the table. Hank reached over without thinking and covered her hand with his own, steady and warm, and she stopped shaking. When it was time, Sarah's lawyer, a sharp young woman named Miss Alvarez, stood calm as still water. "Your Honor, we'd like to call Officer Reyes to the stand." Officer Reyes walked up in his uniform, nodding once toward Hank before taking his seat. He answered questions plainly, professionally, laying out records that made the courtroom go quiet. 3 separate domestic violence complaints filed against Derek Hayes over the past 2 years. 2 restraining orders requested, though never finalized because the woman filing them, Sarah, had been too afraid to follow through. Photographs from a hospital visit 8 months prior, bruising along Sarah's arm that she'd told doctors came from a fall. She never filed charges, Reyes said. But the pattern is there, clear as day. Derek's face went red, his jaw tightening, but his lawyer kept him seated with a hand on his arm. Next came Carol, a volunteer from the women's shelter, soft-spoken but firm. She described the night Sarah arrived, terrified, clutching Grace like she'd never let go. She described the bruises Sarah tried to hide under long sleeves even in summer heat. She wasn't unstable, Carol said, looking directly at the judge. She was scared for her life and her daughter's life. That note wasn't abandonment. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen a mother do. She gave her baby to someone she trusted so Grace would be safe while she found a way out. Finally, Hank was called. He stood slow, feeling every eye on him, feeling 20 years of road dust and grief rising up in his chest. He looked at the judge, not at Derek. Your Honor, I've known Sarah since she was a little girl. Her daddy was my best friend, closest thing to a brother I ever had. I watched her grow up believing her daddy's friends were the toughest, kindest men she knew. He paused, throat tight. When she left that baby with me, it wasn't because she didn't love her. It's because she loved her enough to make sure she was safe, even if it meant being without her for a little while. That's not abandonment. That's sacrifice. He glanced back at the rows of leather jackets filling the courtroom benches. Every one of these men back there will vouch for Sarah. We've already started building her a life near us. Work, a place to stay, People who'll watch Grace grow up surrounded by folks who love her. Sarah's not alone anymore. Neither is that baby girl. We're her family now, whether the court puts it on paper or not. The judge was quiet for a long moment, reading over the evidence spread before her. Then, she looked up, first at Derek, then at Sarah. The judge had ruled in Sarah's favor. Full custody, no conditions, and a restraining order against Derek that actually stuck this time. That had been 3 weeks ago now, and already the world looked different. The little house sat on a quiet street, just 4 blocks from the clubhouse, close enough that Hank could walk there if his knees were acting up. It wasn't fancy. White paint peeling a little at the corners, a porch that creaked when you stepped on the 3rd board, a yard with more dirt than grass. But it was Sarah's, and nobody was going to take it from her. The club had pitched in for the deposit. Dutch had spent 2 weekends fixing the plumbing. Big Jim's wife had donated a crib that her own grandkids had outgrown, and half the chapter showed up one Saturday with paint cans and old furniture, turning the empty rooms into something that looked like a home instead of just a house. Sarah had started work at a diner on 5th Street, the kind of place with sticky menus and a bell over the door, but the owner was kind and the hours worked around Grace's daycare schedule. She came home tired most nights, feet aching, but there was color in her cheeks now that hadn't been there before. She laughed more. She stopped flinching when someone knocked on the door too fast. Hank stopped by most days after his shift at the garage. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he just sat on the porch with a beer while Sarah nursed a cup of tea and told him about her day. Grace would toddle over on unsteady legs, grabbing at his jeans, and he'd scoop her up like she weighed nothing at all, letting her tug on his beard while she giggled. "You don't have to keep coming by every day," Sarah told him one evening, though there was no real complaint in her voice. "I know," Hank said. "I want to." And that was the truth of it. He wasn't doing this because he owed Marcus. He was doing it because somewhere along the way, in the middle of diaper changes and midnight feedings and courtroom battles, this had become his family too. One Sunday morning, Hank asked Sarah if she'd come with him somewhere. She didn't ask where. She just packed Grace into her car seat and followed his bike out to the edge of town, to the cemetery where the grass grew a little wild and the headstones stood in crooked rows under old oak trees. Marcus's grave was near the back, simple granite, his name and dates carved plain and clean. Hank had visited alone plenty of times over the past 2 years, always saying the same things, always carrying the same weight in his chest. But this time was different. This time Sarah stood beside him, Grace balanced on her hip, the baby's small hand reaching out like she wanted to touch the stone. Hank knelt down slow, his knees popping, and rested his hand flat against the granite. "Hey, brother," he said quietly. "Been a while since I brought anybody with me." The wind moved through the oak trees above them, rustling the leaves like a soft answer. "I know I let you down," Hank continued, his voice rough. 2 years I told myself I could have stopped that car, could have seen it coming, could have done something different. Carried that around like a stone in my gut every single day. He paused, looking up at Sarah and Grace standing beside him. "But I think I finally get it now. You didn't need me to fix what happened. You just needed me to look after what you left behind." Sarah's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "She's safe," Hank said, patting the stone gently. "Your girl's safe, and your granddaughter's growing up surrounded by people who'd walk through fire for her. I think that's what you would have wanted. I think that's what you were trying to tell me, even after you were gone." He stood up, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 2 long years. The guilt didn't disappear all at once, but it lifted, like a weight sliding off his shoulders and settling into the ground where it belonged. Grace reached out and pressed her small palm against the headstone, babbling something that wasn't quite words yet, and Sarah laughed softly through her tears. "I think he heard you," she said. Hank nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Yeah," he said. "I think he did." The clubhouse had never looked like this before. Streamers hung from the rafters, pink and white, twisted around old motorcycle parts and beer signs that had hung on those walls for 20 years. A banner stretched across the far wall, hand-painted in crooked letters that read "Happy First Birthday, Grace." The letters a little uneven, because Dutch had insisted on doing it himself despite Big Jim's wife offering to print one instead. "A man's gotta do things with his own 2 hands," Dutch had said, and nobody argued with him, even though the P in happy looked more like a lowercase b. Balloons covered the floor, dozens of them, and every time someone walked through the room their boots sent a few skittering across the concrete. The bikers, men who'd spent their whole lives looking tough for the world, spent that Saturday afternoon batting balloons back and forth with a 1-year-old who shrieked with laughter every time one bounced off her head. Sarah stood near the folding table loaded with food, a cake in the center with one candle stuck crooked in the frosting. She looked different than she had months ago. Her shoulders sat straight now. Her laugh came easy, no longer something she caught herself doing and swallowed back down. She wore a yellow sundress, and her hair was pulled back. And when she threw her head back laughing at something Big Jim said, Hank thought she looked like a different woman entirely. Not different, just herself again, the self that had been buried under fear for so long. "She's gonna eat that whole cake before we even sing," Big Jim said, watching Grace toddle toward the table with her arms already reaching. "Let her," Hank said. "She's one. She's allowed." Grace wore a paper party hat that kept sliding down over one eye, and every time she pushed it back up, half the room laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. She'd grown so much in a year. Gone was the tiny, fragile thing wrapped in a soaked blanket. In her place stood a sturdy little girl with Marcus's same stubborn chin and Sarah's same quiet eyes, toddling around the clubhouse like she owned the place, which, in a way, she did. Dutch got the guitar out around 3 o'clock, an old beat-up thing he kept in his saddlebag more for show than skill, and he played a slow, off-key version of Happy Birthday, while the whole chapter sang along. Voices rough and mismatched, but full of heart. Grace clapped her hands even though she didn't understand the words, and when they set the cake in front of her, she smashed both fists into the frosting before anyone could stop her, sending a spray of white icing onto Sarah's dress. Sarah didn't even flinch. She just laughed, wiping frosting off her cheek, and kissed the top of Grace's head. By the time the sun started dipping low outside the windows, the party had slowed to something quieter. Half the food was gone. The balloons had lost some of their bounce, drifting lazily along the floor instead of skittering. Most of the club had wandered outside to smoke and talk by the bikes parked along the gravel lot, their voices carrying low and easy through the open door. Hank stepped out too, Grace balanced on his hip, sticky with cake and worn out from the excitement. He walked over to his motorcycle, the same one that had carried him through that storm over a year ago, and eased himself down onto the seat, careful and slow with the baby in his arms. Grace settled against him like she'd done it 100 times before, her small body heavy with the particular exhaustion only babies seem to know. She reached up without looking, her tiny fingers curling around his weathered finger and gripping tight, the way she'd done since she was small enough to fit in one hand. Hank looked out across the lot. Sarah stood near the clubhouse door, laughing at something Dutch said. Her head tipped back, the porch light catching gold in her hair. Behind her, through the open door, Hank could just make out the frame hanging on the clubhouse wall, the glass catching the last of the evening light. Inside it, smeared ink on damp paper, words that had changed everything. Please keep her safe. I love her too much to keep her, but I have nowhere else to turn. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.